Welcome to another big train tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. This week, we'll be taking a look at one of the museum's favorite narrow gauge steam locomotives, Rio Grande Southern Railroad number 20. Purchased in 1952 by the Rocky Mountain Railroad Club, it was moved to Bob Richardson's Narrow Gauge Museum and Motel near Alamosa, and from Alamosa to Golden just a few years later. Today, this venerable locomotive has been returned to operating condition here at the Colorado Railroad Museum, following an extensive 14-year restoration costing over $1.5 million total. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Today's subject locomotive is well known as number 20, having retained that same identity throughout its service life while working for two different Colorado railroads. Like many steam locomotives built for narrow gauge railroads, this unique survivor lasted in service for some 50 years. In number 20's case, the contrast between the fortunes of its two owners makes for an especially colorful story. So now, let's take a look back at this once again operating icon of the fabled Rio Grande Southern Railroad. The Florence and Cripple Creek was the very first railroad to reach the mining bonanza district of Cripple Creek and Victor. Gold had been discovered there just a few years earlier, and the town was booming. Although Colorado was in the midst of a significant economic downturn caused by the silver panic of 1893, Cripple Creek wasn't affected because it was primarily a gold mining area rather than silver. Completed in 1894, the new railroad was an immediate success. Locomotives at first were leased from the Denver and Rio Grande so that the railroad could get started. Then the railroad's own power began arriving, a few locomotives at a time, over the next 5 years. The Florence and Cripple Creek quickly became a bonanza railroad, making money for its investors and then some. It offered overnight through Pullman sleeping car service direct to Denver in cooperation with the Denver and Rio Grande. Two other railroad lines would eventually be built to Cripple Creek, but in the beginning there was plenty of traffic and the narrow gauge's investors made handsome profits. With traffic still booming as the 19th century was ending, the Florence and Cripple Creek needed more locomotives. It ordered 6 steam-powered 10-wheelers intended to pull passenger trains, taking delivery over a period of several months. Number 20 was the second of the new locomotives to arrive. Built by Schenectady Locomotive Works in 1899 and named Portland for one of the mines along the line, this was a powerful and modern locomotive for its time, weighing in at 33 tons. It features 4 leading or pony wheels to help guide the locomotive around curves, 6 driving wheels, and no wheels trailing to support the firebox. The Florence and Cripple Creek's route was a fascinating one. It started at a junction with the Denver and Rio Grande in Florence, located about 9 miles east of Canyon City along the Arkansas River. From Florence, the line headed north, eventually joining the watershed of 8 Mile Creek. The route then continued through a scenic watershed area known as Phantom Canyon, crossing high bridges and long trestles, and tunneling twice through the steep canyon walls alongside the creek. Eventually, the line emerged from the canyon, then climbed rapidly on a route that doubled back on itself to ascend into the mining towns of Goldfield, Victor, and Cripple Creek. Over time, competition came to the region in the form of 2 other competing railroad lines, both of them standard gauge. Just 18 months after the Florence and Cripple Creek arrived, competitor Midland Terminal would complete its line into Cripple Creek from Divide to the north, where it connected with the Colorado Midland Main Line out of Colorado Springs. At first, there was plenty of traffic for both railroads. But in 1901, another railroad company, the Colorado Springs and Cripple Creek District, would build a 3rd line from Colorado Springs southwest and directly up the Front Range to Victor and Cripple Creek. The Little Florence and Cripple Creek, the only narrow gauge of the 3 railroads now serving the district, built a branch line to Canyon City and entered into financial alliances with competitors as it worked to remain profitable. A combination of labor strikes at the mines and, more pressingly, a major washout in 1914 of the narrow gauge railroad line through Phantom Canyon would lead to its demise after just 2 decades of service. Recognizing the futility of rebuilding in this competitive environment, especially as traffic was already declining in the lead-up to World War I, the owners decided to simply call it quits. Today, the unpaved Gold Camp Highway follows much of the former Florence and Cripple Creek from US Highway 50 north through Phantom Canyon to Victor. Enter Part 2 of Number 20's life. Along with its narrow gauge siblings from the railroad, Number 20 was stored for a time. All of the locomotives were known to have been maintained well, since the Florence and Cripple Creek had been financially healthy most of its life. Most of the line's locomotives were eventually sold to other Colorado railroads. The Denver and Rio Grande bought several consolidations, while the Rio Grande Southern ended up purchasing 3 of the line's hefty 460 10-wheelers. The Rio Grande Southern Railroad had its beginnings only a couple years earlier than the Florence and Cripple Creek. Visionary financier Otto Mears, known as the Pathfinder of the San Juans, had started the line to provide railroad service to the mining towns of Rico and Telluride in southwestern Colorado. It ran from Durango to Ridgway, circumnavigating the formidable San Juan Mountains in the process. The route passed over Dallas Divide, west of Ridgway, and over Lizard Head Pass, north of Rico. Perhaps the most notable feature along the route was the Ophir Loop, near Ophir. Like the Florence and Cripple Creek, the Rio Grande Southern at first enjoyed a high rate of return for investors. But then the unthinkable happened in the Panic of 1893. The Sherman Silver Purchase Act was repealed, and the price of silver plunged overnight. Since silver ore and mining-related materials were the Rio Grande Southern's primary cargo, the railroad went into receivership. It came under the control of the Denver and Rio Grande for the rest of its operating life. Until 1951, when it was finally abandoned, the little railroad line would always be in bad financial shape. The Rio Grande Southern never owned any new locomotives, and nearly all of its freight cars and passenger cars and even maintenance of way equipment were likewise used too. The purchase of former Florence and Cripple Creek locomotive number 20 in 1916 fits right into this storyline. This second-hand locomotive would enjoy a long and colorful life on the Rio Grande Southern. As the recent restoration process has clearly revealed, the locomotive worked hard for its second owner. The Rio Grande Southern definitely seems to have squeezed every last bit of utility out of its locomotives in general, and number 20 in particular. The railroad struggled on in the 1920s and 1930s. The lack of paved roads in southeast Colorado helped sustain the Rio Grande Southern, even though it always seemed just a few steps from bankruptcy. Its shop crews developed the famed Galloping Geese motor cars as a practical and cash-saving alternative to running complete steam trains along the line, thus preserving the all-important U.S. mail contract for many years. During World War II in particular, the line received loans from the Defense Supplies Corporation, an agency of the federal government, to assist in keeping the line running. The reason? It was secretly carrying yellow cake ore, used in the manufacture of uranium. After the war, it became clear that this ore had benefited the Manhattan Project, which was producing the world's first atomic bomb. Number 20 was involved in at least one major wreck. In 1943, when it and another locomotive derailed while double-heading a freight train over Sema Summit. The locomotive rolled over, killing a crew member. It was soon rebuilt and returned to service, with a few changes to its appearance. Perhaps number 20's most famous role, though, was starring as locomotive Emma Sweeney in Ticket to Tomahawk, a color Western musical film released in 1950. Filmed along the Denver and Rio Grande Western's Silverton branch, this contemporary comedy romance featured one of Marilyn Monroe's earliest acting roles. Locomotive 20 would also play a short cameo role in the award-winning film Viva Zapatos, starring Marlon Brando a couple of years later. But the Rio Grande Southern's fate was already sealed. Number 20, in its last years, somehow evaded the Interstate Commerce Commission's locomotive inspector every time he showed up. And the locomotive continued running even though perhaps this wasn't a good idea. In 1951, Rio Grande Southern Number 20 pulled the last train of freight cars from along the line and brought them back to Durango. The railroad officially filed for abandonment in 1952 and was dismantled the next year. Today, a number of former Rio Grande Southern locomotives and other rolling stock survive, primarily throughout Colorado and also at Knott's Berry Farm in Buena Park, California. Here at the Colorado Railroad Museum, some of the more notable survivors, in addition to Locomotive 20, include business car Rico, along with caboose 0404. This last, the only item of rolling stock ever built new for the railroad. And of course, Galloping Goose rail cars numbers 2, 6, and 7 are also preserved here in Golden today. As the Rio Grande Southern was shutting down in the early 1950s, Locomotive Number 20 was acquired by the Rocky Mountain Railroad Club. It was placed on display in South Alamosa at the Narrow Gauge Motel and Museum. Founded by well-known Colorado Railroad historian and photographer Robert W. Richardson, this was the genesis of today's Colorado Railroad Museum. In 1958, the museum moved to its present site in Golden, and Number 20 came along as part of the move. The locomotive became a favorite of guests, with its colorful paint being toned down over the years, and it can be seen in many photographs taken over nearly 5 decades. In 2006, the Rocky Mountain Railroad Club formally transferred ownership of Number 20 to the museum. That same year, Locomotive Number 20 began a journey that would last 14 years and cost over $1.5 million along the way. Following a generous lead gift by a donor who hoped that his father might someday see the locomotive again operate, it traveled to Strasburg, Pennsylvania for a complete overhaul. There, Number 20 spent 12 long years having its boiler, frame, running gear, and tender disassembled, assessed, and painstakingly restored. The work was done by the Strasburg Railroad Shops, one of the nation's preeminent steam locomotive restoration and repair facilities. The work took much longer than expected because, as it turned out, the locomotive had been pretty much worn out by the Rio Grande Southern. One of the project's goals, however, was to keep as much of the original fabric of the locomotive as possible. This meant that a lot of extra effort went into repairing and reconditioning the locomotive's many parts and pieces whenever possible, rather than simply replacing them with new material. Because of its poor condition, the firebox was mostly replaced. The boiler shell had been dented out of round during its 1943 wreck and, as it turned out, never returned to a proper state of repair. To correct this, portions of the boiler shell were replaced and carefully stress-relieved at the areas where new materials joined original ones. The locomotive's cast driving wheel centers were cracked and had to be ground out and carefully re-welded. The locomotive's frame had been broken in places and it wasn't even straight, requiring more complex repairs. The list goes on, but hopefully you get the idea. In summer 2019, with its boiler pressure tested and its running gear largely completed, the locomotive returned to Golden in pieces. Since that time, the museum's restoration team has been hard at work, completing final plumbing, reassembly, and testing. A major milestone was reached in May 2020, when hydro tests, which are boiler pressure tests using water rather than steam pressure, and internal boiler inspections were witnessed and approved by the Federal Railroad Administration and the Colorado State Boiler Inspector. Final painting and lettering and testing followed in June and July. The locomotive's official grand rollout was scheduled for August 1st, 2020. Rio Grande Southern Railroad Locomotive Number 20's restoration marks a milestone for the museum. Thanks to many dedicated and generous supporters, a new chapter is beginning for this authentic, revitalized icon of Colorado railroading. Of special note is the fact that the boiler certification meets Federal Railroad Administration standards. This means that Number 20 has the ability to travel off-site for operation on other narrow gauge railroads in the future. 10-wheeler Number 20 remains a wonderful example of a Colorado narrow gauge railroading icon that has traveled a long and winding road during its interesting life. Today, its restored appearance showcases the years immediately following number 20's 1943 wreck and the short time frame that the locomotive served as a wartime asset of a U.S. government agency. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed our tour of Rio Grande Southern Locomotive number 20 as it returns to operational status after nearly 70 years of slumber. I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collections.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.